Asterisk, asterisk, Part 1. The Fateful Letter. Asterisk, asterisk. The air in the Boston parlor hung as thick and silent as the velvet drapes that choked the windows, shutting out the muted gray light of a late autumn afternoon in 1884. For Margaret Whitfield, the silence was a living thing, a weight that pressed down on her shoulders, as tangible as the whalebone corset that cinched her waist into a shape society deemed proper. She was 24, an age when a woman of her standing was expected to be a wife, a mother, or at the very least, a cherished ornament in a respectable household. Margaret was none of these. She was an orphan, a ward, and in the unspoken judgment of her Aunt Eleanor, a disappointment. She sat with a book open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in an hour. Her gaze was fixed on the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light that dared to trespass into the room. They swirled with a freedom she envied, aimless and unbound. Her life, by contrast, was a series of straight, unyielding lines from her chair to the dining table, from the house to the church, from Sunday to Sunday. It was a safe life, a comfortable life, and it was suffocating her. Aunt Eleanor sat opposite her, her knitting needles clicking with the relentless rhythm of a clock measuring out the minutes of Margaret's spinsterhood. "Margaret, dear," she said, her voice thin but sharp, never looking up from her work, "your posture. A lady presents herself with grace, not like a sack of potatoes." Margaret straightened her spine, the corset digging into her ribs. Grace. It felt like another cage. She was born into a world of cages, cages of fabric, of etiquette, of expectation. Her mind, however, refused to be confined. It roamed through the pages of books about botany and geology. It wrestled with newspaper articles about politics and expansion. And it dreamed of places where the sky was not a small square framed by a window, but a vast, unending canvas. The sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the parlor's oppressive quiet. A few moments later, the maid entered, carrying a silver tray. Upon it lay a single envelope, thick and cream-colored, sealed with a splash of black wax. "A letter for you, Miss Whitfield," the maid announced, her voice a respectful murmur. Aunt Eleanor's needles paused. A letter for Margaret was an event. Her correspondence was limited to polite, infrequent exchanges with distant cousins. This envelope was different. It bore the name of a law firm. "Well, don't stare at it, child. Open it," her aunt commanded, a flicker of impatient curiosity in her eyes. Margaret's fingers, steady and precise from years of needlepoint, broke the seal. The paper was crisp, the ink a severe, professional black. She scanned the opening lines, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Asterisk, "Dear Miss Whitfield." Asterisk, it began. Asterisk, "It is with profound regret that we must inform you of the passing of your uncle, Mr. Elias Whitfield." Asterisk. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. Uncle Elias, the black sheep of the family, her father's younger brother, who had turned his back on the family's lucrative shipping business 20 years ago, vanishing into the vast, untamed West with little more than a thirst for adventure and a disdain for Boston's rigid society. He was a ghost, a whispered, cautionary tale of a man who had squandered his inheritance and his name. Aunt Eleanor sniffed. "Elias. I'm surprised he lived this long, a godless man in a godless land." But Margaret felt a pang of something more than surprise. It was a strange, hollow ache for the man she barely knew. The uncle who had once sent her a geode from a place he called the Arizona Territory. A rough, dull stone that, when cracked open, revealed a universe of glittering crystals. She still kept it on her bedside table, a secret talisman of a world beyond her own. She continued reading, her eyes flying across the legal jargon. The letter detailed that, as his closest living relative, she was the sole heir to his estate. The word estate conjured images of land and money. But the reality was far more peculiar. Asterisk, the entirety of his property, which consists of a single commercial enterprise known as Whitfield's Trading Post. Located near the settlement of Sanctuary in the Arizona Territory, the property includes the main building, its stock, and the surrounding acre of land, asterisk. A trading post. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She pictured a dusty, ramshackle building standing alone under an immense, empty sky. It was a world away from the brick and cobblestone of Boston. Her aunt peered at her over the rim of her spectacles. "Well, what did the fool leave you? Nothing but debt, I imagine." As if on cue, Margaret's eyes found the next paragraph. Asterisk. We are obligated to inform you that the trading post carries a significant debt owed to the Northern Mercantile Bank. Furthermore, Mr. Whitfield appears to have maintained complex relationships with the local United States Army garrison at Fort Grant and the neighboring Navajo peoples. The situation is, by all accounts, delicate. Asterisk. Delicate. The word was a masterpiece of legal understatement. It hinted at trouble, at danger, at the very chaos her entire life had been structured to avoid. The lawyer went on to offer his services in liquidating the property to settle the debts. It was the sensible option. The only option. Really, sell this troublesome inheritance from a ghost of an uncle, pay what was owed, and perhaps have a small sum left over. She could then continue her life in Boston, safe and secure, until she faded into the parlor's velvet shadows just as her aunt was doing. She folded the letter, the sharp creases a mirror of the sudden, decisive turn in her thoughts. She looked at her aunt, at the clicking needles, at the suffocating room, and then she looked past them, through the window, to a sky she could not see but could suddenly, vividly, imagine. A sky so vast and blue it could swallow a woman whole and birth her anew. "I'm not going to sell it," Margaret said, her voice quiet but firm. A stone dropped into the still pond of the parlor. The knitting needles stopped. "What did you say?" "The trading post. I'm not going to sell it. I'm going to go there." Aunt Eleanor stared at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. "Don't be absurd. A single woman, traveling to that savage place. It is unthinkable. It is scandalous. You would be ruined." "I am already ruined, Aunt," Margaret replied, the truth of the words surprising even herself. "I am 24 years old with no prospects, no passion, and no purpose other than to ensure my posture is acceptable. I would rather be ruined in a place where I can breathe than be preserved in a place where I cannot." The argument that followed was long and bitter, but it was like a summer storm breaking against a granite cliff. Margaret's resolve, once formed, was unshakable. For the first time in her life, she was not bending to the will of another. She was charting her own course. The letter was not a burden, it was a map. The inheritance was not a debt-ridden building, it was a key. 2 weeks later, Margaret Whitfield stood on the platform of a train station, a small trunk at her feet containing all she had chosen to keep of her old life. She wore a practical traveling dress of dark wool, her hair pinned up simply, free from the intricate constructions her aunt favored. The journey west was a blur of noise and motion, a slow, relentless shedding of her former self. The train carried her across rolling green hills that flattened into endless plains, the landscape growing starker and more expansive with every mile. The clatter of the wheels was a constant refrain asterisk going somewhere, going somewhere. From the end of the rail line, she took a stagecoach, a bone-jarring, dust-choked affair that rumbled through a world of red rock and thorny brush. The other passengers were rough-looking men prospectors, ranchers, a quiet man with a gun on his hip who gave her curious, assessing glances but mostly left her alone. She was an anomaly, a plainly dressed but clearly well-bred woman traveling by herself into the heart of the territory. She learned to live with the fine red dust that coated everything, to drink the alkaline water that tasted of the earth, and to sleep sitting up as the coach swayed through the night. She saw her first coyote, a flicker of gray in the twilight, and watched eagles ride the thermal currents high above canyons that seemed to slash the earth to its very bones. The scale of it all was overwhelming. It made her feel infinitesimally small, and yet, for the first time, utterly and completely alive. The stagecoach finally deposited her in sanctuary. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of others that looked as if they were held up by sheer force of will. The sun beat down with a physical weight, and the air was dry and hot. Men stopped what they were doing to stare at her as she stepped down from the coach, their faces weathered and suspicious. This was not a place that welcomed outsiders easily. Following the directions the lawyer had provided, she found Whitfield's trading post at the far end of the street, set slightly apart from the rest of the town. It was a long, low building made of thick adobe walls, with a sturdy plank roof and a wide, covered porch. It looked solid, permanent, like it had grown out of the red earth itself. It was not the ramshackle hut she had imagined. It had a quiet dignity. Her uncle's folly, perhaps. But it was a folly built to last. With her trunk left on the porch, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was cool and smelled of dust, tanned leather, coffee beans, and something else, a faint, spicy scent like cedar and sage. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the interior in hazy shafts. Shelves lined the walls, some still holding goods, tins of coffee, bolts of calico, sacks of flour, while others were empty. A thick layer of dust covered everything. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden counter, its surface scarred with the knife cuts and coin marks of countless transactions. It was a place of ghosts. She could almost feel her uncle's presence, see him standing behind that counter, a man who had traded Boston certainties for this. She ran a hand along the worn wood, feeling a connection to him, a flicker of understanding. She moved through the main room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. A door at the back led to a small, Spartan living area, a simple cot, a table with one chair, a cold wood-burning stove. This was where he had lived. This was where he had died. Another door, smaller and set into the far wall of the living quarters, was slightly ajar. Curiosity, stronger than any sense of trepidation, pulled her toward it. It opened into what must have been a storeroom. It was darker in here, the air thick and strangely metallic, like the scent of old blood. And then she saw him. On a pallet of blankets in the corner, a man lay utterly still. He was Navajo, his heritage clear in the strong lines of his jaw and cheekbones, the copper tone of his skin. A fall of straight, jet-black hair was spilled across the dusty blanket. He was stripped to the waist, wearing only a pair of worn buckskin trousers, and his torso was a terrifying landscape of injuries, both old and new. Long, faded white lines crisscrossed his skin scars from knives or arrows. She couldn't tell, but it was the newer wounds that made her breath catch in her throat. A dark, ugly bruise spread across his ribs, and a makeshift bandage on his shoulder was stained with a dark, ominous patch. He was breathing, but it was a shallow, ragged sound, a struggle for every gasp of air. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lawyer's words echoed in her mind, complex relationships. A delicate situation. Here was the delicate situation, lying wounded and perhaps dying in the back room of her new home. Every instinct she had inherited from her life in Boston screamed at her to turn, to run, to find the sheriff, to rid herself of this dangerous complication. But as she looked at the man on the floor, she didn't just see a savage, as her aunt would have called him. She saw a human being, broken and in pain. And she saw the story of this land written on his very skin, a brutal, violent history etched in a map of scars. Her decision in the Boston parlor had been an act of will, a theoretical leap into the unknown. This, she realized, was the first true test. This was the moment her new life began. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret Whitfield closed the door to the street, shutting out the world she knew. She walked back into the storeroom, knelt beside the unconscious warrior, and began to think about how to save his life. Part 2. The Man in the Sickbed, For a long moment, Margaret remained frozen, the dust of the storeroom seeming to settle in her lungs, making it hard to breathe. The world she had known, a world of polite conversation and predictable days, had vanished, replaced by the stark reality of this dark room and the dying man on its floor. The rasp of his breath was the only sound, a fragile thread of life in the profound silence of the trading post. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her composure. The teachings of her aunt, the ingrained prejudices of her society, rose up like a chorus of ghosts. An Indian, a savage, dangerous. They were words spoken with absolute certainty in Boston parlors, axioms of a world that believed itself civilized. But here, under the Arizona sun, the words felt hollow. What she saw was not a savage. She saw a man laid low, his body a testament to a life of brutal hardship. Her paralysis broke. This was not a problem of social etiquette. It was a matter of survival, his survival. Her mind, so long starved for purpose, seized the task with a desperate clarity. First, light. She retreated to the main room, her hands trembling slightly as she found one of her uncle's old kerosene lamps. After a few tries, she coaxed a flame to life, the warm, yellow glow pushing back the shadows. With the lamp held high, she returned to the storeroom. In the steady light, the man's condition looked even more dire. His skin was hot to the touch, dry with fever. The bandage on his shoulder was a crude affair, little more than a strip of torn shirt, and the wound beneath it was angry and inflamed. It needed to be cleaned. He needed water. She moved with newfound purpose. In the small living quarters, she found a tin basin and a bucket with a few inches of stale water at the bottom. It wouldn't do. She hauled the bucket outside to the well, the rope coarse and unfamiliar in her soft hands. The bucket came up heavy and sloshing with cool, clear water. This simple act, drawing water under the vast, indifferent sky, felt more real than anything she had ever done in Boston. Back inside, she set a pot to boil on the stove, feeding the firebox with wood from a small pile nearby. While it heated, she searched for anything that might serve as medical supplies. In a small, locked chest at the foot of her uncle's cot, she found not a key, but a small, leather-bound journal. Setting it aside for the moment, she forced the lock with the tip of a fireplace poker. Inside were not the bandages she'd hoped for, but Elias's personal effects, a few tarnished silver dollars, a compass, and a folded photograph of her parents. Beneath them, however, was a small bottle of laudanum and another of carbolic acid, a harsh but effective antiseptic. It was more than she could have hoped for. With sterilized cloths, the basin of warm water, and the carbolic acid, she returned to the man's side. Gently, cautiously, she began to peel away the makeshift bandage. The flesh beneath was torn and dark, the wound deeper than she'd feared. A gunshot, she surmised, the bullet having passed clean through. The injury itself was grave, but it was the fever that would kill him. As she worked, cleaning the wound with a diligence that bordered on desperate, her mind raced. To go for help meant exposing him. The town sheriff, the marshal, they called him here, might see a wounded Navajo not as a patient to be saved, but as a criminal to be jailed, or worse, the townsfolk, whose suspicious eyes she had already felt upon her, would surely not understand. They would call her a fool, or something far uglier. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this. The decision to stay, to tend to him, was hers and hers alone. It was a line being drawn in the dust of her new life. On one side lay safety, conformity, and a return to the familiar world that had nearly smothered her. On the other lay this dangerous, frightening, and profound responsibility. Hours passed. She cleansed the wound as best she could, diluted the carbolic acid and applied it, watching his body jolt from the sting even in his unconscious state. She tore strips from one of her own clean petticoats to create a proper dressing. She dribbled water between his cracked lips, most of it spilling down his chin, but some of it getting through. She bathed his face and chest with a cool, damp cloth, trying to fight the fever that radiated from him like a furnace. It was in this intimate, clinical work that she began to see him not as a threat, but as a person, and she began to read the story written on his skin. Her gaze traced the silvery line of a scar that ran from his collarbone down to his sternum, a thin, neat mark that spoke of a sharp blade and a close fight. Another, a puckered, angry star on his thigh, looked like the mark of an old arrow wound. His knuckles were flattened and calloused. His back, when she managed to shift him slightly to clean it, was a crosshatch of fainter marks, the kind left by a whip or a thorny branch. This was no abstract concept of a warrior. This was the living, breathing chronicle of a life forged in violence. Each scar was a sentence, each wound a chapter in a story she couldn't read but was beginning to feel. He had survived things she could barely imagine. Who was this man? Who could endure so much and still cling to life with such tenacity? Needing a moment's respite, her back aching and her hands stained, she picked up her uncle's journal. She sank into the single chair at the table, the lamplight flickering over the pages. Elias's handwriting was a messy, energetic scrawl. Most of the entries were simple notes about trade goods, the weather, or dealings in town, but the last few pages were different. They were more personal, tinged with worry. Asterisk, October 14th. Asterisk, an entry read, Asterisk, Naichi came by today. He looks haunted. Says the tensions with Morrison's cavalry patrol are getting worse. The captain is a hard man, looking for a reason to prove his worth, and he sees the Dine as his stepping stone. I told Naichi to be careful. He carries too much of the past with him. The name leapt from the page. Asterisk, Naichi. Asterisk. She read on, her heart quickening. Asterisk, October 16th. Trouble east of the canyon. A supply wagon hit. Morrison will blame the first Navajo he sees. He'll blame Naichi. I know he will. Naichi's reputation precedes him, and not always for the better. He has done things in the name of his people he does not speak of, but he is a good man. The best I know. The final entry was dated the day before the lawyer's letter was sent. Asterisk, October 19th. He is here. Stumbled in just after sundown, a bullet in his shoulder. Says it was a misunderstanding with some freighters, but I suspect it was Morrison's men. He's burning with fever. I've hidden him in the storeroom. I have to get him clear of sanctuary before the marshal comes sniffing around. He trusts me. He is my friend. I will not fail him. Margaret closed the journal, a profound sadness washing over her. Her uncle had not failed his friend. He had died before he could finish the job. And now, that responsibility had passed to her. The nameless man in the storeroom now had a name, Naichi Yazi. He was her uncle's friend, and Captain Morrison, the U.S. Army, and a whole town of suspicious strangers were likely looking for him. The knowledge settled not as a weight, but as a clarification. Her choice was no longer just about defying a vague societal pressure. It was about honoring her uncle's last act, about protecting a man who was not a stranger, but a friend of the only family she had left in this vast, lonely place. For 2 more days, she was his sole guardian. The trading post her fortress, the world outside ceased to exist. She slept in snatches on the cot, waking at every moan or shift from the storeroom. She learned the rhythms of his fever, the way it peaked in the dead of night and subsided into a clammy exhaustion near dawn. She forced broth, water, and a few drops of laudanum for the pain past his lips. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to win the battle. The heat of his skin lessened. The angry red around his wound began to fade, and his breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. On the third day, a sharp rap on the front door sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She quickly covered Naichi with a spare blanket, pushed the storeroom door almost completely shut, and smoothed her apron, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She opened the main door a crack. A tall man stood on the porch, a silver star pinned to his vest. He had a weathered face, a drooping mustache, and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Marshal Brody? Just wanted to officially welcome you to Sanctuary. Heard you were Elias's niece." "Yes, Margaret Whitfield," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you, Marshal." Sad business about Elias. He was Elias, kept to himself mostly, Brody said, his eyes scanning the dusty interior of the post behind her. "You planning on staying long or just selling the place off?" "I haven't decided yet," she lied, praying he wouldn't ask to come in. "I'm still taking stock of things." "Right. Well, a word of advice. Miss Whitfield, this ain't Boston. Be careful who you trust. Elias had dealings with all sorts. Some of them, not the kind a lady like yourself should be involved with." His gaze was pointed. He knew something, or suspected it. "I'll keep that in mind." "Marshal," she said, forcing a polite smile. He nodded, seemingly satisfied for the moment. "If you need anything, my office is just next to the saloon. You let me know." He tipped his hat again and walked away, his spurs jingling softly in the quiet street. Margaret closed the door, her back pressing against it as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The danger was real. It had a name and it wore a star. That night, the fever finally broke. She was changing the dressing on Naichi's shoulder when his eyes fluttered open. They weren't the unfocused, delirious eyes of the past few days. They were dark and clear, and they were staring directly at her. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. His gaze held a mix of profound confusion and deep, primal alarm. He was a warrior, and he had woken up wounded and weak in an unfamiliar place, with a white woman leaning over him. His eyes darted around the dim room, taking in the shelves, the lamplight, and then locking back onto her face. He tried to push himself up, a low groan escaping his lips as pain shot through his shoulder. "Be still," Margaret whispered, her voice gentle but firm as she placed a hand on his uninjured arm. "You're safe here. You've been very ill." He did not relax, but his effort to rise subsided. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of guarded intensity. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a deep, wary assessment. The man her uncle had called friend was awake, and Margaret knew, with absolute certainty, that the fight for his life was over, but the challenge of earning his trust had just begun. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 3, Two Worlds. Collide, asterisk, asterisk. The first few days after Naichi awoke were a battle of silences. He would watch her, his dark eyes missing nothing. As she brought him broth and water, he took what she offered without a word, his movements economical and precise, betraying a strength that was rapidly returning to his limbs. But his gaze was a wall, impenetrable and cold. He was a prisoner of his own weakness, and Margaret was his reluctant warden. She was the face of the people who had taken his land, killed his kin, and now, through a strange twist of fate, had saved his life. The debt was an uncomfortable weight between them. Margaret, in turn, fought her own battle against the intimidation she felt under his constant scrutiny. She refused to be cowed. She moved about her tasks with a quiet efficiency, speaking to him in a calm, even tone, expecting no reply. "My name is Margaret Whitfield," she told him on the second day, as she changed the dressing on his shoulder. "Elias Whitfield was my uncle. I inherited this post from him." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes at the mention of Elias's name, not surprise, but a deep, sorrowful acknowledgement. It was the first crack in his wall of silence. The moment she had been both dreading and anticipating came as she cleaned the healing wound. Her supply of clean cloths was dwindling, and this time, her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of fatigue and nervousness, slipped. The pads of her fingers brushed against the uninjured skin of his shoulder. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange jolt through her. His skin was not like any she had ever touched. It was warm, smooth, and firm, the color of rich, sun-baked earth. It felt alive, radiating a vitality that stood in stark contrast to the pale, almost translucent skin of the men she had known in Boston. She pulled her hand back as if burned, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. For an instant, their eyes met. She saw confusion in his gaze, a questioning look that mirrored her own. She felt a sudden, dizzying curiosity. This man's body, so different from her own, was a landscape of experience, marked by hardship and survival. The touch, so simple and clinical in its intent, had become something else entirely. It was an awakening of a sense she didn't know she possessed, a sudden awareness of the profound and unbridgeable difference between their two worlds, and yet the undeniable reality of their shared humanity. She quickly finished her task, her hands suddenly feeling large and awkward. "Your uncle, he called you Naichi," she said, her voice barely a whisper, using the name from the journal as a bridge. He remained silent, but the hardness in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. He had not offered his name, but he did not correct her. It was an acceptance, a small concession in their silent war. By the end of the week, he was strong enough to sit up on his own, and a few days after that, he was walking, favoring his shoulder but moving with a lithe, animal grace that made the small storeroom feel like a cage. The trading post, which had been Margaret's sanctuary, now felt impossibly small with his presence filling it. The reality of their situation soon became clear. The sacks of flour and beans were dwindling. The money from her uncle's chest would not last forever. The trading post could not remain a silent, shuttered hospital. It had to become a business again, or they would both be destitute. "I have to open the post," Margaret announced one morning. She had spent the previous day sweeping away the thickest layers of dust and attempting to organize the shelves, her efforts feeling hopelessly amateurish. Naichi was sitting at the small table in the living quarters, his back straight, his posture one of patient observation. "You do not know the trade," he said. It was not a question or a criticism, but a simple statement of fact. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble that seemed to carry the resonance of the canyons. "No," she admitted, turning to face him. "I do not. I know books and needlepoint and which fork to use at dinner, none of which seems particularly useful here. But I am not helpless. I can learn." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze assessing her determination. Then, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The Bilagana, the white people, they will trade for flour, coffee, sugar, and metal goods. They pay with cash. When they have it." He paused. "The Dinan. My people, they trade for those things, but also for colored cloth, velvet, and beads. They bring wool blankets, silver jewelry, and baskets." Elias understood the value of both. And so began their unlikely partnership. Naichi, still healing, became her tutor. From a chair placed strategically on the porch, he would watch the approach of any potential customers. "An army wife," he would murmur as a woman from the nearby fort walked up the street. "Offer 2 cents less per yard on the calico." "Her husband is a sergeant. His pay is small." "This is a Navajo silversmith," he'd say as a man with long, graying hair and hands stained with his craft approached. "His work is good. Do not insult him with a low price for his wool. Offer him flour and the blue velvet he favors for his wife." Margaret was a quick study. She learned to weigh goods, to haggle without being disrespectful, and to differentiate between a finely woven blanket and a mediocre one. She learned a few words of the Navajo language. Ya at e for hello. Ahe. For thank you, her pronunciation stiff and foreign. But her effort was noted and appreciated by the Navajo customers who had trusted her uncle. The trading post slowly came back to life. The bell above the door began to jingle again, and the shelves started to empty and be restocked. But with the renewed activity came renewed attention. Sanctuary was a small town, and a mystery was more valuable than gold. The presence of an unmarried white woman from the east was a novelty. The fact that she was successfully running the trading post, a place that had been shuttered for weeks, was a source of endless speculation. Whispers started in the general store and blossomed in the saloon. They said she was eccentric, that she was above herself. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched with disapproval, made it her mission to observe the trading post from behind the curtains of her parlor across the street. One afternoon, the bell on the door jingled, and Margaret looked up to see Reverend Miller standing there, his hands clasped over a round belly. He was a man who carried his piety like a shield, his smile benevolent, but his eyes cold and judgmental. "Miss Whitfield," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "a pleasure to see you breathing life back into this establishment. I've come to welcome you properly to our small community and to offer the spiritual guidance of my church." "Thank you, Reverend," Margaret said, her hands resting on the counter. She had a feeling this was not a social call. "Your aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, has written to me," he continued, his smile tightening. "She is most concerned for your welfare and for your soul. She worries you are alone here, without proper protection or guidance." "My aunt worries a great deal," Margaret said evenly, "but I am quite capable of looking after myself." Of course," the Reverend soothed. "But this is a rough land. My dear, it is not Boston. There are influences here that can lead a fragile spirit astray. People are talking. They say you are keeping company that is unsuitable for a Christian woman." His meaning was as clear as the glass in the window. He meant Naichi, who was at that moment out of sight, checking inventory in the storeroom. Margaret felt a cold anger rise within her. "The only company I keep, Reverend, is my own, and that of the customers who come to my door. I trade fairly with everyone, as my uncle did before me. Is that not a Christian principle?" The Reverend's smile faltered. "Fair trade is one thing, Miss Whitfield, but one must be mindful of appearances. To associate too closely with the natives, it invites trouble. It sets a poor example, for your own good. I urge you to be cautious." He placed a small pamphlet on the counter. "Our Sunday service is at 10. I hope to see you there." He left, and the bell's jingle sounded like a final warning. The rift was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. The society she had been born into was closing its doors to her, one judgmental glance and one veiled threat at a time. She looked at the pamphlet asterisk, "Finding Salvation in a Savage Land" asterisk, and swept it into the trash. In the evenings, after the last customer had gone and the heavy wooden bar was dropped across the door, a fragile peace would descend on the trading post. This became Margaret's favorite time of day. She and Naichi would often sit on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the sky, setting the distant red rock mesas on fire. The silence between them now was different. It was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a shared space, a comfortable quiet born of mutual respect and the shared experience of their strange, intertwined lives. Sometimes he would speak, telling her the Navajo names for the constellations that pricked the darkening sky. He would point out the sacred mountains that bounded the Navajo world, explaining their significance with a simple reverence that moved her. In turn, she would tell him about the ocean, trying to describe the sheer, endless expanse of gray water, the taste of salt on the air, the cry of gulls. To him, who had only ever known this vast, dry land, her world was as alien as his was to her. "You read many books," he observed one evening, nodding toward the small volume of poetry she had brought with her from Boston. "Yes," she said, They were my only escape. Escape from what? From a life that felt like a cage. She answered honestly. A beautiful, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. He was silent for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. My people were put in a cage once, he said, his voice low, at a place called Bosque Redondo. It was not beautiful or comfortable. She had read about it the long walk, the forced internment of the Navajo people years ago, but hearing it from him, the quiet pain in his voice made the historical fact a living wound. She said nothing, knowing that no words she could offer would be adequate. She looked at his profile in the fading light, the strong line of his nose, the resolute set of his jaw. She thought of the scars his body carried, and the deeper, invisible scars he carried in his soul. Her cage had been one of velvet and lace. His had been one of starvation and death. And yet, here they both were, sitting on this porch, two survivors of different worlds, finding a strange, quiet solace in each other's company. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a peace she had never known in the manicured gardens and silent parlors of Boston. It wasn't the peace of safety or security. It was the peace of purpose, of standing on her own 2 feet in a world that was vast and dangerous, but also filled with a raw, breathtaking beauty. She had come west seeking freedom, and she was beginning to find it, not in the empty landscape, but in the quiet moments shared with the man beside her. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 4. She'd never seen a man's body, asterisk, asterisk. The weeks bled into a month, and a rhythm settled over the trading post, as steady and quiet as a slow heartbeat. The days were for work, for the careful dance of trade and barter, the exchange of goods and brief, polite conversations. But the nights belonged to the Nituem. The evenings on the porch had become a silent, necessary ritual, a time to shed the day and simply be. The sun would set, the stars would emerge, and in the shared darkness, the space between their two worlds seemed to shrink. Naichi's wound was all but healed. The angry gash had closed, leaving behind a puckered, deep red scar that would, in time, fade to the silvery white of his other marks. The routine of her tending to it was no longer a necessity, but a habit neither of them seemed willing to break. It was a moment of quiet focus, a reminder of their strange beginning. One evening, after she had barred the door and the last of the light had drained from the sky, she brought the lamp and the small tin of healing salve to the living quarters. Naichi was waiting, sitting on a low stool by the cold stove, as he had done countless times before. He pulled his cotton shirt over his head, his movements fluid and unself-conscious. Margaret knelt before him, just as she had that first night, but everything was different now. Then, he had been a nameless, unconscious figure, a problem to be solved. Now, he was Naichi. He was her partner, her tutor, her confidant in this vast and lonely land. She dipped her fingers in the cool, herbal salve and gently applied it to the new scar. The clinical nature of the task had long since faded, replaced by a familiar intimacy. Her hands knew the landscape of his shoulders, the hard muscle beneath the skin, the varying textures of old scars and healthy flesh. But tonight, as her work finished, her hand stilled. Her gaze drifted from the new scar to the old ones. She saw them not as separate injuries, but as a sprawling, interconnected map, a long, straight line that sliced across his ribs, a cluster of small, jagged marks high on his chest, the faint, lattice-like pattern on his back she had only glimpsed before. They were a language she did not know, telling a story of a life she could not comprehend. The words came out before she could stop them, a quiet confession into the lamp-lit silence. "I've never seen a man's body before," she murmured, her eyes still fixed on the scar across his ribs. "Not really. In Boston, men are just suits of clothing. They're hidden. All you ever see are their hands and faces." A hot wave of embarrassment washed over her the moment the words were out. It was a shockingly intimate admission, a transgression of every rule of propriety she had ever been taught. She felt foolish, naive. She expected him to laugh, or to pull away, to cover himself and end this strange ritual for good. She risked a glance at his face. Naichi did not move. He did not speak. He did not even seem to breathe. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. There was no judgment in his eyes, no mockery. There was only a profound stillness, a silent gravity. His silence was not an absence of response. It was the response itself. It was permission. It was a quiet offering of trust so absolute it stole the air from her lungs. He was giving her leave to look, to understand. Her hand, which had frozen in embarrassment, slowly, tentatively, lifted again. This time, it was not the doctoring hand of a nurse. It was the hand of a scholar, a cartographer faced with a new and uncharted world. She let the tips of her fingers rest on the old, white line across his ribs. The scar tissue was smooth, cooler than the surrounding skin. "A knife," she whispered. He gave a single sharp nod. Her fingers traced the scar's path, feeling the hard bone of his ribcage beneath. She imagined the moment of impact, the searing pain, the struggle for life that must have followed. She moved higher, to the jagged cluster of marks on his chest. They felt different, rougher. "Shrapnel," he said, his voice a low rumble. "From a soldier's cannon." She flinched, her hand pulling back. He had fought the army. He had fought men who looked like her, who came from her world. The reality of the chasm between them was suddenly, violently present. But he remained still, his patience a silent reassurance. Hesitantly, she resumed her exploration. Time seemed to dissolve. The lamp hissed softly, the only sound in the room. Her touch became bolder, driven by a deep, aching need to comprehend the life this body had endured. This was not a caress of affection. It was an act of reading. She was learning his history through her fingertips. She touched the puckered circle on his thigh, a wound she had noticed in the early days, an arrowhead. She felt the thick, ropey muscle of his arms that had drawn a bow, guided a horse, and held him up through unimaginable pain. She turned her attention to his hands, taking one of hers. She traced the calluses on his palms, the flattened knuckles, the faint white lines that spoke of smaller, more frequent battles. These hands had created the beautiful silver jewelry he sometimes brought to the post to trade. They had also known violence. They were hands that knew how to both build and destroy. Finally, she moved behind him, her knees brushing the floor as she looked at the map on his back. The faint, crisscrossing lines were more visible up close. They were old, almost faded completely into his coppery skin. She didn't need to ask. She knew what they were from. The stories of the taming of the West were not just in books. They were written here, on his skin. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her sorrow, anger, and a profound, humbling awe. Her own struggles, the velvet cage she had so desperately fled, seemed like a child's fantasy next to the brutal reality etched into this man's flesh. Her touch softened. The academic curiosity began to dissolve, replaced by something far more elemental. Her fingers were no longer just reading, they were communicating. They were offering a silent apology for the cruelty of her people. They were expressing a wordless reverence for his survival, for the sheer, indomitable strength of his spirit. She was no longer exploring a man's body. She was communing with a man's soul. The air in the room grew thick, charged with the weight of everything unspoken between them. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin, the scent of wood smoke and sage that clung to him, the sound of his steady, even breathing. He remained completely still, a statue of living rock, allowing her this unprecedented intimacy, this silent confession. He was giving her a piece of himself that he had likely never given to anyone, a truth more raw and honest than any story he could tell. When she finally drew her hands away, the silence they left behind was vast and ringing. She felt drained, as if she had run for miles. She couldn't look at him. She stood up, her legs unsteady. "Thank you," she whispered to the floor, the words feeling pitifully small. She fled to her cot in the corner of the room, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, her back to him. She heard the soft rustle of his shirt as he put it back on, and then the quiet sound of his footsteps as he retreated to his own blankets in the storeroom. Sleep did not come. Her mind was a whirlwind of images and sensations, the feel of scar tissue, the warmth of his skin, the immense, patient stillness of him. She had crossed a line, a boundary she didn't even know existed, and she could never go back. When she finally did drift off, her dreams were vivid and strange. She dreamt she was in a vast canyon at twilight, the rock walls around her glowing red. She reached out to touch them, and the stone was warm and smooth, like skin. She felt no fear, only a sense of profound belonging, as if the landscape itself was holding her. A voice echoed in the canyon, speaking a language she didn't know, but the meaning was clear in her heart. "You are safe here. You are known." She awoke with a start in the deep, velvet dark before dawn. The dream was already fading, but the feeling it left behind was intensely real. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a powerful, terrifying clarity. She lay still, staring into the darkness toward the storeroom where he slept. She replayed the events of the evening, the hesitant confession, his silent permission, the long hours of discovery. And she understood. The fascination, the deep well of empathy, the desperate, consuming need to understand him, to know his story. It had a name. It was not just respect. It was not just friendship. She was in love with Naichi Yazi. The realization was a quiet explosion in the center of her soul, shattering the last remnants of the woman she had been. It was impossible. It was dangerous. It was the truest thing she had ever known. Part 5. The Gathering Storm. The morning after her revelation, the world looked both the same and entirely different. The dust motes still danced in the shafts of sunlight. The scent of coffee and leather still filled the air. But a new, fragile, and terrifying awareness colored Margaret's every perception. When Naichi entered the main room from the storeroom, his presence was no longer just a familiar feature of her new life. It was a physical force, a gravity that pulled her attention and set her heart to a faster rhythm. She busied herself behind the counter, her movements a little too quick, her focus on a stack of tin plates unnaturally intense. He seemed to notice the change. His usual morning greeting, a simple, quiet nod, was followed by a long, searching look. He saw the new tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze. But he said nothing. His own stillness, a question she was not ready to answer. The fragile intimacy of the night before had been replaced by a shimmering, unspoken tension. Love, she was discovering, was not a peaceful state. It was a form of high alert. Their uneasy silence was shattered just before noon by the sound of approaching horses. It was not the slow, ambling walk of a single rider, but the rhythmic, synchronized beat of a patrol. A knot of ice formed in Margaret's stomach. She looked at Naichi. His face had become a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the door, his posture instantly shifting from one of quiet repose to coiled readiness. 4 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms reined in their horses directly in front of the trading post. They were led by an officer whose uniform was a little crisper, his back a little straighter than the others. He dismounted with an air of practiced authority, his spurs ringing on the wooden porch. He was a man in his late 30s with a square jaw, cold blue eyes, and a palpable air of impatience. This, Margaret knew with a sickening certainty, was Captain Morrison. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, the bell jangling violently, and strode inside. his men remaining on the porch, their presence a silent, looming threat. His gaze swept the room, dismissing the shelves of goods, dismissing Margaret, until it landed on Naichi. A small, cruel smile touched his lips. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the clipped accent of an East Coast military academy. "Look what the cat dragged in. Naichi Yazi, I heard you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Seems you just fell into a hole." Naichi did not respond. He simply stood, his arms loose at his sides, his stillness a more potent form of defiance than any words could have been. Morrison finally turned his cold eyes to Margaret. He raked her up and down with a look that was both contemptuous and proprietary, as if she were a piece of property that had fallen into the wrong hands. "And you must be the niece, the lady from Boston, Elias Whitfield's last mistake." "I am Margaret Whitfield," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "This is my property. What is your business here, Captain?" "My business," Morrison said, stepping closer to the counter, "invading her space is justice. A U.S. Army supply wagon was attacked 3 weeks ago. 2 men were killed. The tracks led toward Navajo territory, and a certain Navajo warrior, known for his distaste for Army supply wagons, conveniently disappeared right after. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "You've been harboring a fugitive, Miss Whitfield, a murderer." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was exactly as her uncle's journal had foretold. "You have no proof," Margaret stated, her chin rising. Morrison laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Proof, ma'am. Out here, a wounded Indian on the run is all the proof I need. I'm here to take him back to Fort Grant for questioning. I'm sure we can be very persuasive." "He has been here, under my care, for nearly a month," she countered, her mind racing. "He was gravely injured. He could not have attacked anyone." "Or perhaps his injury is what stopped him from finishing the job," Morrison retorted smoothly. "Don't be a fool, girl. You're out of your depth. This savage has filled your head with lies. Step aside and let me take him. I'm doing you a favor. I'm cleaning up your uncle's mess." Margaret looked from Morrison's smug, cruel face to Naichi. He was still silent, watching, waiting. He was leaving the choice to her. This was her property, her world, and in that instant, her love for him, so new and terrifying, crystallized into something hard and unyielding loyalty. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This man is under my protection. You will not take him. If you have a warrant from a judge, you may present it. Otherwise, you will leave my trading post." Morrison's face darkened with rage. To be defied by a woman, in front of his men, was an insult he could not stomach. "You are making a grave error, Miss Whitfield. You are choosing your side, and I promise you, you will regret it." He spun on his heel and stalked out, his men following, their expressions a mixture of surprise and menace. They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of red dust and a ringing silence in their wake. The storm had broken. The town's verdict was swift and brutal. By that afternoon, it was as if a quarantine sign had been hung on the trading post door. "Mrs." Gable was seen speaking in hushed, frantic tones to anyone who would listen on the street. When Margaret walked to the general store for supplies, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, who had been friendly just the day before, suddenly found himself too busy to serve her. Women she had exchanged pleasantries with now crossed the street to avoid her, pulling their children close as if she were a carrier of some vile disease. The whispers followed her everywhere, * Indian lover, traitor. She returned to the trading post, her face pale, but her expression set like stone. She had known this would happen. She had read the Reverend's warning in his eyes, but knowing it and living it were two different things. She was an island, and the sea of hatred was rising around her. That evening, they did not sit on the porch, The world outside was no longer safe. They ate a silent meal of beans and stale bread inside. The heavy bar secured across the door. The unspoken love that had filled Margaret with such turmoil that morning now seemed like a distant luxury. It had been replaced by something more primal, the fierce, desperate bond of two people against the world. "They will come back," Nietzsche said, finally breaking the silence. He was not looking at her, but at the door, as if he could see through the thick wood. "Morrison," she asked. "Not him. Not yet. The others. The men from the saloon. The ones who call themselves a militia. They will come to teach the woman a lesson. They will come to prove they are brave." There was no fear in his voice, only a weary certainty. Margaret looked around the room, her uncle's legacy, her new home, and she knew he was right. They had made a stand, and the world would not let it go unanswered. She went to her uncle's chest and took out the one thing she had left untouched, a heavy, long-barreled Colt revolver. She checked the cylinder. It was loaded. Her hand did not tremble as she laid it on the counter. The attack came after midnight. It began with a crash of breaking glass as a rock shattered one of the front windows. Then came the voices, rough and slurred with whiskey. "Come on out, Yazzie, we got a rope for you. And we got something for your white squaw, too." Margaret's blood ran cold, but there was no time for fear. Nietzsche was already moving, blowing out the main lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the broken window. He pressed her against the wall behind the counter, a rifle she hadn't known existed now in his hands. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low whisper, an instrument of calm command in the chaos. Another crash, and the front door shuddered under the impact of a heavy log. They were trying to break it down. A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the wooden door frame. Margaret crouched behind the counter, the heavy Colt clutched in both hands. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. This was real. This was not a story in a book. Men were trying to break into her home to hurt them, to kill them. With a final splintering crack, the bar across the door gave way, and the door flew open. 3 figures silhouetted against the moonlight spilled into the room. Nietzsche's rifle exploded with a deafening roar. One of the figures screamed and fell back out onto the porch. The other 2 scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. A bullet ricocheted off a cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall near Margaret's head, the whine of it sharp and terrifying. Then, one of them saw her. A large, bearded man she recognized from the saloon let out a triumphant roar and lunged over the counter. He was fast, and Nietzsche was occupied with the other intruder. He landed heavily on the floor beside her, the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies rolling off him. He grabbed for her, a wild grin on his face. "Now, little lady," he snarled. "Time for your lesson." All the propriety, all the fear, all the parts of Margaret Whitfield that belonged to Boston vanished in a blaze of pure, primal survival. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She raised the heavy pistol with both hands, aimed it at the center of the dark mass in front of her, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The kick of the gun threw her back against the shelves, her ears ringing. The man above her made a strange, grunting sound, a sound of profound surprise. He stood frozen for a second, his wild grin still on his face, before he crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain. Silence. The other intruder, hearing the shot and his companion's fall, fired one last panicked shot into the ceiling and then fled into the night. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Margaret's own breathing and the soft dripping of something onto the floorboards. Moonlight fell through the open door, illuminating the scene. The body of the man she had shot lay a few feet from her, still and lifeless. Nietzsche was at her side in an instant. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, his hands checking her for injuries. She shook her head, unable to speak. She couldn't take her eyes off the dead man. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, the surprise still etched on his face. A dark pool was spreading out from beneath him, She had done that. Her finger had pulled the trigger that had ended his life, extinguished his thoughts, silenced his voice forever. A wave of nausea and shock so profound it buckled her knees washed over her. She had taken a human life. The act was a chasm, a line she had just crossed from which there was no return. The woman she had been just minutes before was gone. But as Naichi helped her to her feet, his hand a firm, steady presence on her arm, another feeling rose through the shock. It was not guilt, it was not regret. It was a cold, hard, terrifying certainty. She had killed to protect him, to protect their life together. And looking from the body on the floor to Naichi's face, etched with concern in the pale moonlight, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she would do it again. The world had declared war on them, and she had just fired the first shot of her own. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 6. Destiny's Choice, asterisk, asterisk. The aftermath of the violence was a ringing, deafening silence. The body of the man lay on the floor, a stark and terrible monument to the night's brutality. For a long, frozen moment, Margaret could do nothing but stare, the heavy Colt still warm in her hand, its weight a permanent part of her. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, a scent she knew would haunt her forever. It was Naichi who broke the spell. He moved with a swift, grim purpose that sliced through her shock. There was no panic in him, only the cold, practical focus of a man long accustomed to the bloody consequences of survival. "We cannot leave him here," he said, his voice low and steady. "The marshal will come with the dawn." Together, in a state of shared, silent horror, they dealt with the grim task. They wrapped the body in a spare canvas tarp and, using one of the trading post's pack mules, carried it out into the darkness of the surrounding desert. Naichi found a deep, rocky wash far from the town, a place where the coyotes and the elements would quickly erase all traces. Margaret did not watch him commit the body to the earth. She stood with her back to him, staring up at the cold, indifferent stars, and felt the last pieces of the Boston woman she had been turned to dust and blow away on the night wind. They returned to the trading post before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. The broken door, the shattered window, the dark stain on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. They were all evidence of a line that had been crossed. The fragile peace of their shared world had been irrevocably shattered. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the damaged room, Naichi faced her. The weariness of the long night was etched on his face, but his eyes held a new, hard resolution. "I will leave today," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, like stones dropped into a deep well. Margaret, who had been numbly sweeping up shards of broken glass, stopped. "What?" "They came for me," he stated, his gaze fixed on the splintered doorframe. "The trouble with Morrison, the hatred in this town, it follows me. I brought it to your door. Last night, you did what you did because of me." He finally looked at her, and she saw a deep, unfamiliar pain in his eyes. "I will not let you become like me, hunted, hated, with blood on your hands for my sake. If I am gone, Morrison will have no more cause to trouble you. The town will forget. You can be safe again." It was, she knew, an act of love. He was trying to protect her, to cut himself out of her life like a poison before it could spread further. He was offering to take the darkness with him and leave her in the light, but his logic was a knife to her heart. Safe. The safety he spoke of was the same stifling, airless safety she had fled in Boston. It was a cage, and she would not go back. "No," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with a sudden, fierce anger. "Absolutely not. You do not have a choice." "Margaret," he said, his tone unyielding, "I will not be the reason for your destruction." "My destruction?" She took a step toward him, the broom forgotten in her hand. "My destruction was happening in a parlor in Boston, dying a little bit every day. My life started here. In this place, the night I chose to save yours, and you think you can just take that away from me? I am saving you from it, he insisted, his jaw tight. That was when the anger broke its dam. Her love, her fear, her shock, and her fierce, newfound loyalty all coalesced into a single, defiant challenge. She threw the broom down, the clatter echoing in the tense silence. "Saving me, or saving yourself?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is this what you do?" "Naichi, when the world becomes too hard, when people hate you for what you are, do you simply run and hide? Are you going to run away now? Just because you're afraid of what a few ignorant, hateful people think?" He stared at her, stunned into silence by the ferocity of her words. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing into his. "If that's the kind of man you are, then my uncle was wrong about you. And if you run, then I'm the biggest coward of all for killing a man to protect someone who would just abandon me to be Zafes." The accusation hit him with the force of a physical blow. She saw him flinch, his mask of stoic resolve cracking. She had taken his act of protection and reframed it as an act of cowardice, a betrayal not just of her, but of her sacrifice. "I did not choose this life. Margaret," he finally said, his voice ragged with a pain he rarely showed. "I have spent my years fighting for my people, fighting to survive in a world that wants me dead. I have never asked anyone to share that fight." "And I am not asking for your permission," she cried, tears of frustration and fury finally spilling down her cheeks. "I am telling you, I am here. I am not leaving. My place is with you. If you fight, I will fight. If you run, I will run with you. But you will not leave me behind. Do you understand I chose this? I chose *you*. The unspoken words "I love you" hung between them, as real and tangible as the broken furniture and the smell of blood. He looked at her, at this impossible woman from another world who had nursed him, defied soldiers for him, and now had taken a life for him. He saw not a fragile Eastern lady who needed protection, but a warrior in her own right, her spirit as fierce and unyielding as any he had ever known. He saw her love, not as a weakness or a burden, but as a shield, a fire, a source of incredible strength. To leave her now would not be an act of protection. It would be the greatest act of cowardice of his life. It would be to deny the most powerful and unexpected gift he had ever been given. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he closed the distance between them. He raised his hand and gently, reverently, wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Your fire," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "burns brighter than any I have ever seen." It was not an apology. It was a surrender. It was a vow. He was not leaving. They would face the storm together. 3 days later, an old man arrived on a gray pony. He was thin and wrinkled, his face a beautiful, intricate map of long years. He introduced himself with a quiet dignity as Hastin Naichi's maternal uncle. News of the attack on the trading post had reached the Navajo lands, carried on the wind like smoke. He spent the day in quiet observation, watching Margaret bind a customer's cut finger, watching her trade fairly for a bundle of wool, watching the way she and Naichi moved around each other in the small space, a silent dance of complete understanding. That evening, he spoke to them both as they sat inside the now-repaired trading post. "Your spirits are tied together," Hastings said in a mix of Navajo and the careful English he'd learned over years of trade. "This is clear, but you walk in two worlds, and both are dangerous. To the white man, you are an outlaw, and she is a traitor. To my people, she is a stranger. A bond must be made, to give you both strength and a place to stand." He proposed a traditional Navajo wedding ceremony. It would not be recognized by the laws of the territory, he explained, but it would be recognized by the Din. It would make Margaret one of them, binding her not just to Naichi, but to his clan, his family. It would grant her their protection and formally sanctify the union they had already forged in blood and fire. Margaret agreed without hesitation. The ceremony was held 2 days later, not in a church with a pipe organ and stained glass, but inside a traditional hogan, its circular walls built of earth and cedar. The air inside smelled of juniper smoke and sacred corn pollen. There were no crowds, only Heston, a few of Nietzsche's close relatives, and a medicine man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the desert itself. Margaret wore a simple blue dress, and Nietzsche wore traditional Navajo clothing of soft buckskin and velvet, following the medicine man's instructions. They washed each other's hands in a clay bowl to cleanse away their pasts and all that was ugly. They sat facing east, and a basket filled with corn mush was placed between them, with a pinch of sacred pollen. The medicine man drew a cross on the mush, from east to west and from north to south. Nietzsche ate from the east side of the basket, and Margaret ate from the west. Then they ate from the south and the north. They shared from the center, a symbol that they would now share everything in their lives: sustenance, sorrow, and joy. Hastings spoke of K's or the Navajo system of kinship and harmony, explaining that their marriage made Margaret a daughter to his clan. There were no rings, no formal vows in English. There was only the chanting of the medicine man, the taste of corn and pollen, and the profound, humbling feeling of being accepted into a world of ancient tradition. When they emerged from the hogan into the brilliant sunlight, Margaret felt a sense of peace she had never imagined. She was no longer just Margaret Whitfield. She was Nietzsche's wife. She had a people. But they both knew this was only half the battle. "Now," Nietzsche said, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together for the first time. "We fight them with their own weapons." The next day, they rode south for 2 days to Tucson, the territorial capital. The city was a bustling, chaotic hub of commerce and law, a world away from the quiet dignity of the hogan. They found the office of a justice of the peace, a tired-looking man with ink stains on his fingers and a weary expression that suggested he had seen everything. He looked at them, the tall, imposing Navajo man and the determined white woman, and his expression soured with disapproval. He asked the required questions in a monotone, his pen scratching across the legal document. "Name?" "Nietzsche Yazzie." "Margaret Whitfield." The justice paused, looking up at her. "You're sure about this, ma'am?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, her voice ringing with a confidence that made the man sigh and return to his paperwork. They signed their names on the crisp legal document. It was a cold, impersonal act, a world away from the sacred ceremony in the hogan. But as Margaret wrote her name, she felt a thrill of defiance. This piece of paper was a weapon. It made her his legal wife. It gave them rights. It was a shield, a claim they were staking in the center of the world that hated them. They walked out of the dusty office and into the harsh Tucson sun. Husband and wife in the eyes of two laws, two cultures, two worlds. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. Morrison was still out there. The town of Sanctuary was still waiting. But they would face it together, their lives no longer separate, their destinies now a single, shared path. They were a union, an impossible bridge built between two shores, and they would not let the storm wash them away. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 7, The War of Pen and Paper. Asterisk, asterisk. Returning to Sanctuary was like riding back into the heart of a silent storm. The town watched them. Their legal marriage in Tucson, a known fact, carried on the telegraph wires and the wagging tongues of stagecoach drivers. The whispers that had once followed Margaret now became a wall of cold. Hard silence. Doors closed as she passed. Eyes turned away. They were pariahs, their union an unforgivable sin in the town's unwritten Bible of prejudice. But the heavy bar across the trading post door at night felt different now. It was not just a defense. It was the gate to their own small kingdom, a world of two forged into one by law and by love. They threw themselves into the work of the post, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythms of trade. The Navajo people, Hearing of their union through Heston's clan came with a new sense of ownership and trust. They brought their finest blankets and silver, and their presence became a quiet, steady bulwark against the town's hostility. A few Mexican families from the surrounding ranches, long treated as outsiders themselves, also continued their trade, their interactions with Margaret and Naichi marked by a shared, unspoken understanding of what it meant to live on the margins. The peace, fragile as it was, lasted less than a fortnight. Captain Morrison returned, but this time he did not come with the bluster of a raid. He rode at the head of a small, formal escort, an official-looking document held in his gloved hand. He dismounted and stood on the porch, his expression one of triumphant vindication. Marshal Brody was with him, his face grim and uncomfortable. "Miss Whitfield, or I suppose it's Mrs. Yazzie now," Morrison began, savoring the name like a foul taste. "Your little games are over?" He unfurled the document with a sharp snap. "This is an executive order from the Department of the Army, countersigned by the territorial governor. It declares this property a strategic asset, vital to the security of Fort Grant and subject to immediate military seizure for the purpose of establishing a supply depot. You are to vacate the premises within 48 hours. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie, a fabrication built on Morrison's influence and the territory's ingrained fear of the Navajo. He had found a way to use the law as a weapon, to evict them not with bullets, but with bureaucracy. Marshal Brody cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "Margaret, the order appears to be legal. My hands are tied." Naichi stepped forward, his body a rigid line of fury. His hand drifted instinctively to the knife at his belt, but Margaret put a hand on his arm, a silent command. She looked at Morrison, at the smug, assured victory on his face, and the woman from Boston, the one who understood the power of paper and ink, rose from the ashes of the gunfight. "This is my property, Captain," she said, her voice devoid of the panic she felt. "Deeded to my uncle and passed to me. You cannot simply seize the land of a United States citizen without due process." Morrison laughed. "Due process, ma'am. This is the Arizona territory, and you ceased to be a respectable citizen when you chose to side with a hostile. This order is your due process. 48 hours. He turned to leave, his victory complete. That night, the trading post was silent, but it was the silence of a war room. Naichi paced the floor, his anger a palpable force in the small space. "We can fight," he said, his voice a low growl. "My people will stand with us. We can make them pay for every inch of this ground." Margaret looked at him, her heart aching with love for his fierce, protective spirit. But she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "If we fight them with guns, we become everything they say we are. We become the savages in their story. They will hunt us down, and they will win, because they have more guns, more soldiers, and more laws written to protect them." She walked to her uncle's old writing desk, a relic of a more civilized world. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped a pen in the inkwell. "My whole life, I was taught that the law was a shield to protect the righteous. Morrison is using it as a club. It's time," she said, her eyes meeting his, a new, cold fire in them, "that we learn to use it as a sword." For the next 2 days, while the clock on Morrison's ultimatum ticked down, Margaret did not sleep. She fought a different kind of war. First, she wrote to the Arizona citizen in Tucson. Her letter was not a plea for sympathy. It was a carefully crafted argument, a fiery condemnation of military overreach. She did not write as Naichi's wife. She wrote as Margaret Whitfield, an orphan from the East, a woman alone, who had inherited a small business and was now facing eviction by a power-hungry army captain. She wrote of property rights, of the sanctity of a citizen's home, of the dangerous precedent being set when the military could simply seize what it wanted under the guise of security. She painted Morrison not as a protector of the peace, but as a tyrant threatening the very freedoms the settlers had come west to find. She sent the letter with a young Navajo boy on their fastest horse, promising him a silver dollar for every hour he shaved off the journey. Next, she went through her uncle's papers. She found what she was looking for, a small, worn leather portfolio containing his personal correspondence. In it was a series of letters from a Judge Lawrence Albright, a retired territorial judge living in Tucson. The letters spoke of a deep friendship, of a time Elias had helped the judge's family during a bout of fever, of a shared belief in a West built on justice, not just brute force. Her second letter was to the judge. In it, she enclosed a copy of her uncle's deed, a copy of her marriage license, and a detailed, factual account of Morrison's vendetta. From the false accusations to the mob attack, to this final legal assault, she did not beg for his help. She appealed to his honor, to his friendship with her uncle, and to his duty as a man of the law to see that justice was not perverted by personal hatred. Her final battle was for the heart of sanctuary itself. She walked out of the trading post and directly to Henderson's general store. The proprietor tried to busy himself with a barrel of pickles, but she stood at his counter until he was forced to look at her. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice calm and businesslike. "In 2 days, the army is seizing my trading post. When they do, the Navajo trade will stop. The wool that goes to the mills, the silver that your wife so admires, the money the Navajos spend in this very store on supplies, it will be gone. Captain Morrison may feel more secure, but the purse of every merchant in this town will be a great deal lighter." She left him to his pickles and went to the blacksmith, to the saloon owner, to the freight agent, delivering the same simple, undeniable message. She was not asking for their friendship. She was appealing to their greed. The morning of the 48th hour arrived, gray and tense. Margaret and Nietzsche stood on the porch of the trading post, waiting. They were not alone. Across the street, a small group of townspeople had gathered Henderson, the blacksmith, a few others. They weren't there with guns. They were simply watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and a new, grudging concern. A little way down the road, a larger group of Nietzsche's kin had assembled, sitting silently on their horses, their presence a powerful, unspoken statement. Morrison arrived with a dozen men and a supply wagon, ready to begin the eviction. He saw the gathered crowd and his face tightened with annoyance, but he pushed forward, confident in the power of the document in his hand. He reined in his horse. "Time's up. Mrs. Yazzie, I trust you've packed your things." "This is still my home, Captain," Margaret replied, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "Not for long," he sneered, and gave the order for his men to dismount and begin clearing the building. As the first 2 soldiers stepped onto the porch, Marshal Brody rode up, his horse kicking up dust. He was not wearing his usual grim expression. He looked agitated, and he was waving a piece of paper. "Hold on," Captain Brody called out, his voice sharp with authority. "A telegram just came through from Tucson, from Judge Albright." Morrison's confident smirk faltered. "What about him?" "He's issued a temporary injunction, effective immediately." Brody announced, reading from the telegram, "It freezes your seizure order pending a full judicial review of its legality. He cites concerns over a citizen's property rights and potential abuse of military authority. Until he reviews the case, this trading post remains the legal property of Mrs. Margaret Yazzie." The word struck Morrison with the force of a physical blow. He was defeated, not by a rifle, but by a thin piece of paper sent along a wire. He stared at Margaret, who stood on the porch, her expression calm and unyielding. He saw the faint, triumphant smile on her lips, and his face contorted with a silent, impotent fury. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted by the very woman he had dismissed as a foolish girl, humiliated in front of his men and the entire town. Morrison had no choice. He snatched the telegram from Brody's hand, read it, and crumpled it into a ball. Without another word, he spun his horse around and rode away, his men scrambling to follow. leaving the empty supply wagon behind like a monument to his failure. A quiet cheer went up from the Navajo riders. "In town, Mr." Henderson tipped his hat in a gesture of grudging respect. The battle was over. The war of pen and paper had been won. In the weeks that followed, the trading post was transformed. The failed seizure had broken the back of Morrison's influence and the town's unified hostility. People began to see the post not as a source of trouble, but as what it was, the steadfast center of the community's commerce. The townsfolk, their economic interests secured, began to trade again. The Mexican ranchers came more frequently, and the Navajo, their trust in Margaret and Nietzsche absolute, made it the heart of their trade network. The languages of English, Spanish, and Dine Bizad now mingled under the porch roof. White ranchers haggled good-naturedly with Navajo weavers, their wives exchanging patterns and gossip. Mexican vaqueros traded leather goods for tools, sharing stories with Nietzsche about horses and cattle. It was not a perfect world. The old prejudices still simmered beneath the surface, but a new community was being forged in the crucible of their struggle. A community based not on the color of one's skin, but on the shared, practical needs of survival and the grudging respect that had been earned in the face of tyranny. The trading post was no longer just a building. It was a bridge, and Margaret and Nietzsche were its keepers. Asterisk, asterisk, Part Tionde, Love and Legacy. Asterisk, asterisk. The years that followed were not a story of grand battles won, but of a quiet, stubborn peace built one day at a time. The seasons turned, etching deeper lines into the faces of the mesas and the people who lived in their shadows. The trading post, once a symbol of defiance, slowly became something else, an institution. It was the unshakable center of a small, unique world, a place where the threads of many cultures were woven together, sometimes awkwardly, but always with the steady hands of Margaret and Nietzsche at the loom. Margaret gave birth to their first child, a son, in the small room behind the counter, with a Navajo midwife and Nietzsche holding her hands. They named him Samuel, after her father, a name from her old world. But his Navajo name, given to him by Heston, was Atsa, eagle, for the way his sharp, dark eyes seemed to see everything. 2 years later, a daughter was born, Ilara, a name Margaret had found in a book of stars. For she was born on a clear, cold night when the Milky Way was a brilliant sash across the sky. Her Navajo name was Hozho, a word that meant so much more than its English translation of beauty and harmony. It was a state of being, a balance with the world. Their children grew up in the space between. They learned English from their mother's books and the stories of Shakespeare she would read aloud on quiet evenings. They learned the Dine language from their father, from the songs he would hum while mending a saddle, and from the long, rambling stories their great-uncle Hestin would tell on his frequent visits. They were fluent in the language of coin and credit behind the counter, and the language of the clouds and the direction of the wind. Samuel had his mother's fair skin, but it tanned to a deep brown in the Arizona sun, and he had his father's jet-black hair and quiet, observant eyes. Ilara had her father's copper skin and high cheekbones, but her eyes were her mother's, a startling hazel green that held a spark of unyielding determination. They were children of two worlds, and they bore the burden and the blessing of it every day. The prejudice of sanctuary had not vanished. It had simply retreated, festering in the darker corners of the town. There were still mothers who pulled their children away when Samuel and Ilara passed. There were still whispers. The word asterisk, half-breed asterisk, sometimes hissed like a snake from the shadows of the saloon. One hot summer afternoon, when Samuel was 10, he came running back to the post, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his lips split and bleeding. A group of older boys from the town had cornered him, calling him a savage and trying to cut his long black hair. Nietzsche's face became a thundercloud, and he started for the door, his hands clenched. But Margaret stopped him. "Wait," she said, her voice low. She knelt and cleaned her son's face. her touch gentle but her eyes hard as flint. She did not coddle him or tell him the boys were wrong. She looked him straight in the eye. "What did you do?" she asked. "I fought back," Samuel mumbled, wincing as she dabbed his lip. "I remembered what Father taught me. I knocked the biggest one down." "Good," Margaret said simply. "Now, go wash up. We have work to do." But the incident had an unexpected consequence. The next day, Mr. Henderson from the general store came by. He was an old man now. His back stooped, but his eyes were clear. He didn't say anything about the fight. He just handed a sack of hard candy over the counter to Samuel. "For a brave young man," he grunted, and then, looking at Margaret, he added, "My own grandson was one of those boys. He spent last night learning a long overdue lesson about respect from the end of my belt. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a sign that the bridge they had built was, slowly, being crossed by others." Marshal Brody, now gray and nearing retirement, became a quiet ally. He would sit on their porch some evenings, sharing a cup of coffee and news from the territory. His presence a silent deterrent to any who might still harbor violent thoughts. Even Reverend Miller, in his old age, seemed to soften, once remarking with a sigh that the Yazzie children were surprisingly well behaved and had a better grasp of the parables than most of the children in his Sunday school. The trading post became their legacy. It was more than a store. It was a sanctuary in truth, a place of fairness and refuge. It was a bank for the Navajo, a post office for the isolated ranchers, and a neutral ground where disputes were settled not with guns, but with quiet talk over coffee. Margaret's knowledge of law and letters, combined with Naichi's deep understanding of the people and the land, made them a formidable force for a quiet kind of justice. The years spun on, turning the children into young adults. Samuel, with his father's stillness and his mother's keen mind, began to take over more of the trading, his fluent command of all three languages making him a natural diplomat. Ilara, fiery and independent, became a renowned horsewoman and a healer, learning the traditional Navajo herb lore from her great-uncle and modern medicine from her mother's books. They were the living embodiment of the world their parents had built, strong, resilient, and belonging fully to both sides of their heritage. One cool autumn evening, decades after a fateful letter had first brought her west, Margaret sat on the porch beside Naichi. They were old now. Her hair, once the color of rich brown soil, was a river of silver braided down her back. The whalebone corsets of her youth were a distant, absurd memory. Her body was shaped now by childbirth, hard work, and the free, easy way she moved through her world. Naichi's face was a beautiful, intricate canyon of lines, each one earned, the scars on his body, the ones she had once explored with such timid curiosity, were pale and soft, a faded map of a life long lived. The sun had set, and the sky above was a deep, cloudless, velvet black, strewn with a profligate spray of stars. The Milky Way was a shimmering river of light, so bright and close it felt as if you could reach up and trail your fingers through it. The air was crisp and smelled of pinon smoke and the coming winter. The sounds were the familiar night symphony of the desert, the chirp of crickets, the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. They sat in the comfortable, easy silence they had perfected over a lifetime together, their chairs close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. They had watched this same sky from this same porch for more than 40 years. It had witnessed their struggles, their sorrows, and their quiet, unshakable joy. Margaret leaned her head back, her gaze lost in the river of stars. She thought of the frightened, determined young woman she had been, stepping off a stagecoach into a world of dust and sun. She thought of the wounded warrior in the back room, a man whose body was a testament to a life of pain. She thought of the gunfight, the legal battles, the children, the slow, hard-won peace. It had been a full life, a hard life, a beautiful life. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked softly, her voice a little thin with age, but still clear. Naichi was silent for a long moment, not because he had to search for the answer, but because he was savoring the question, the culmination of their long journey. He reached out and took her hand, his own weathered and calloused, and laced his fingers through hers. Her hand, though wrinkled, was still strong. "No," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, as deep and steady as the earth beneath them. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes, which had never lost their intensity, reflecting the starlight. "We built a world of our own, you and I, right here." She squeezed his hand, a feeling of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming, settling into her soul. He was right. Their legacy was not in the money they had made, or the enemies they had defeated. It was here, in the quiet space between them. It was in their children, who now slept in the house behind them. It was in the bridge they had built and held together with nothing but stubbornness and love. They had taken two separate, warring worlds, and on this small patch of dusty land, they had forged a new one, a world just big enough for the two of them, and for the love that had defied it all. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.